Chapter 9. The Egyptian Question. The racial classification of the ancient Egyptians even now remains a thorny issue. Many writers and television documentary makers still depict them as Caucasians or mulattoes, usually offering no evidence at all to support these unscientific portrayals. Professor Eric Hornung of the University of Basel, for example, makes the bizarre suggestion that the Egyptians did not encounter Negroes until well into the 18th dynasty period, echoing the argument refuted at the Cairo Symposium. We reproduce the professor's own words on this point. At the south of his empire, Thutmosis III, i.e. Thutmose III, also reached beyond the previous borders. The region of Napata at Gebel Barkal, where he had a stele set up in 1433 BCE, was included in the province of Kush, and the Fourth Cataract would remain the southern boundary of Egypt for a long time to come. Here the Egyptians came into contact with black Africans who were henceforth to appear in the representations and tombs along with other foreigners. The English Egyptologist Mr. Michael Rice takes a different position. His ancient Egyptians were Negroes, but after admitting this, Rice felt compelled to racially abuse them. The culture which grew and flourished in the Nile Valley was wholly autochthonous. It grew out of the lives and preoccupations of the cattle-rearing African peoples, black Africans, it must certainly be acknowledged, who were the true ancestors of the Pharaohs in all their majesty and power. The Egyptians long held on to the recognition of their essentially African character. Incidentally, even in the Middle Kingdom, the king would be portrayed in all barbaric splendor of an African chief. On the atypical occasions that writers attempt to present evidence of non-Negro ancient Egypt, they usually try to base their position on 10 lines of argument. 1. Caucasians were the first people in North Africa. 2. Even if the prehistoric population of North Africa were Negroes, they were conquered and displaced by a dynastic race from Europe and Asia. 3. The ancient Egyptians, and for that matter the Moors, Libyans, and Berbers, spoke Semitic or Afro-Asiatic, i.e. languages that originated in Middle East. This implies that the people were also of Middle Eastern origins. 4. Herodotus' account of Egypt cannot be trusted. 5. Egyptian skulls share affinities with Europeans. 6. Egyptian mummies such as Yuya, Thoya, and Ramses II possess blonde or red hair. Other mummies show straight hair. 7. Only some of the dynasties possess kings that one can usefully call black. 8. The Egyptians distinguished themselves from Negroes in their literature. 9. The Egyptians distinguished themselves from Negroes in their art. 10. Physical anthropology has shown the Egyptians cannot be classified as black or white. It is easy to show that all these arguments are naive, outdated, false, or fraudulent. Furthermore, they can all be easily dismissed by counter-evidence. The evidence for human origin suggests that the first human inhabitants of all lands except the Americas were Negroes. The Caucasians evolved in southern France or southern Russia from Negroes that migrated from Africa to these regions. The early black migrants to Europe and Asia probably entered Spain via Morocco and Israel via Egypt. Since Morocco and Egypt are both in North Africa, it is difficult to see how the original inhabitants of North Africa could have been anything other than Negroes. Of course, Oliver, McGivity, and Weiner do not need to bother offering evidence to prove that North Africa was originally Caucasian. Presumably, their say-so is good enough. In any case, their views are refuted by the Saharan rock paintings dating back 10,000 years. As Dr. Davidson has noted, the paintings show people that are obviously African in origins. Finally, Henry Lote remarked that the earliest art was apparently the work of Negro artists. Concerning the identity of prehistoric Egyptians, we cite the outstanding research of Dr. Keith Crawford, an African-American scholar. His essay, The Racial Identity of Ancient Egyptian Populations Based on the Analysis of Physical Remains, contains the following anthropological evidence. The earliest modern human fossils found in Egypt was the skeleton of the Nazlet Kader man found near Tadar. Egypt was dated at 35,000 to 30,000 BC, Upper Paleolithic period. Regarding the racial affinity of the skeleton, Toma, 1984, concludes, strong alveolar prognathism combined with fossa pronalysis is suggested of Negroid morphology. In 1982, Wendorf discovered a skeleton at Wadi Kuvinya, located 10 to 15 kilometers north of Aswan in Egypt. The skeleton dated to approximately 20,000 BC. The wide nasal aperture, lower nasal margin morphology, presence of the succulus pronalysis, wide interorbital distance, and alveolar prognathism demonstrate affinities with broad African variants, i.e. Negroid traits. Stewart, 1985. Green and Armalagos, 1964, analyzed a collection of crania from Wadi Halfa dating from 13,000 to 8,000 BC. The skulls were dolichocephalic with bun-shaped regions, massive brow ridges, sloping foreheads, great alveolar prognathism, large teeth, and large, deep mandibles. Reitmeyer, 1975, notes a similarity between this population and skeletons from West Africa. Tamaya Mellet, Niger, and El Guttaria, Mali. Dr. Crawford uses the term broad African to refer only to those African populations with broad faces, broad flat noses, and prominent jaws. His research shows that from 35,000 BC to 8,000 BC, only Negro skeletons have been found in Egypt. He goes on to discuss the pre-dynastic Egyptian cultures of Badaria and Nagada. Using improved statistical analysis, Kita, 1990, observed, the Badarian crania have a model metric phenotype that is clearly southern. Most classify into the Kerma, Nubian, Gaboon, and Kenyan groups. He further reports no Badarian cranium in any analysis classified into the European series. The Nagada culture period that followed the Badarian period had also been shown to have consisted of populations with affinities to broad African populations. One of the earliest studies to characterize Nagada crania was conducted by Fawcett, 1902. She identifies the characteristics of the Nagada race, commenting, "We are dealing therefore with a long-headed, narrow-faced race with flat nose and rather round orbits." Nutter, 1958, compared Nagada, Badarian, and Kerma, Upper Nubia, skulls, and concluded the three groups were almost identical, all of them possessing broad African phenotypic traits. See Keita, 1990. The view that invaders from Europe and Asia overwhelmed a pre-dynastic Negro Egypt in early times is very deceptive. There are two Egyptian documents which could be interpreted to imply that Caucasians invaded the northern coast at an early date. Narmer's tablet and the instruction of Mary Carey. Narmer's tablet gives a pictorial record of the great First Dynasty monarch conquering enemies and uniting Egypt into a single state for the first time. Many scholars have suggested that Caucasians were among the defeated enemies of Narmer, i.e. Minna, therefore implying that they must have entered the land at an early date to become an enemy. Pharaoh Khedi VII of the 10th dynasty wrote the instruction of Mary Carey for his son. Mary Carey, it was a political guide for the young man, instructing him how to rule wisely when he inherited the throne. The text warns him of trouble that Asiatics, i.e. Caucasians, could cause and implied that they had always been a menace to the Egyptians from time immemorial. The phrase given is, he, the Asiatic, has been fighting since the time of Horus. Yet, he does not conquer, nor is he conquered. Our view is that even if these documents are interpreted to show that there were Caucasians in Egypt from before the First Dynasty, those same documents indicate that the Egyptians kept them at bay and considered them enemies. The real evidence deflates even these pretensions, however. The surviving statues of the Old Kingdom pharaohs, including Narmer, the founder of the unified Egypt, show ambiguous Negro faces. We can only agree with Pierre Montet, a French Egyptologist, who described the Old Kingdom rulers as possessing unusually large, almost flat noses, thickish lips, and somewhat low foreheads. Such were, without exception, the kings of Egypt at the time of the Old Kingdom. The Egyptian language was at one time classified as non-African tongue. The scholars claim that it belonged to a Middle Eastern language family called Semitic. This position, however, was publicly refuted once and for all. In 1974, UNESCO called the now historic conference the Cairo Symposium. UNESCO's aim was to sponsor the writing of authentic history of Africa, but the ancient Egyptians and their place in African history was a major sticking point. 20 of the world's leading Egyptologists participated, including Professor Cheikh Anta Diop and Professor Theophile Obenga. The two Africans presented a mass of linguistic comparisons between Egyptians and Wolof, Senegalese, and Egyptian and Bantu languages. It was generally agreed among the participants that the Egyptian language was indeed an indigenous African tongue related to other African languages. Moreover, the Semitic or Afro-Asiatic language group did not, however, originate in the Middle East as it is popularly believed. Joseph Greenberg, a linguist of great distinction, demonstrated that their true origins were in Ethiopia. Ethiopia and Eritrea has the largest number of Semitic languages spoken today, such as Tigrinya and Amharic. Cushitic languages are also spoken in this region. He, Greenberg, discarded as imprecise and illogical such familiar linguistic categories as Semitic and Hamitic, says a modern scholar in favor of a more inclusive category, which he termed Afro-Asiatic. In Greenberg's opinion, this category was justified by the demonstrable affinities between Semitic Hebrew, Arabic, Phoenician, Aramaic, and Amharic on the one hand, and the Northeast African group formerly Hamitic, comprising Egyptian, Kushite, Chadic, and Hausa on the other. According to Greenberg, the long-dead mother tongue of all these languages would have originated in the highlands of Ethiopia. What this means, in effect, is that so-called Semitic languages are but branches of original Northeast African parent, of which Egyptian and Cushitic are charter members. Dr. Christopher Ehret, another recent authority, comments that the old Western and Middle Eastern presumption that the Afro-Asian, Afro-Asiatic language family originated in Asia can simply no longer be sustained now that we have large amounts of first-rate data from the African branches of the family. But this newer evidence is still almost to most scholars of the Semitic and ancient Egyptian languages, with the consequence that an unbalanced understanding of the family continues to prevail in many quarters. Unfortunately, the outdated view Afro-Asian as having an Asian origin continues to affect not only popular thinking, but also the interpretation of scholars in other fields, such as biological anthropology, who study Africa. Some readers are disturbed by the idea that the Semitic and Egyptian languages are related, because they think such a relationship would make Egyptian an Asian language. Of course, that is not so. Semitic alone, among all the divisions of the Afro-Asiatic family, consisted in earlier times of languages of the far southwest corners of Asia, spoken even right next to Africa. All the rest of the divisions are entirely African, and the only reasonable interpretation of this evidence is the Semitic was a solitary Asian offshoot of the family, brought into Asia long ago by immigrants from Africa. It has also been a puzzle to us as to how Dr. Greenberg located the parent of Semitic in highlands of Ethiopia. We have an idea that he derived this view from Herodotus. Herodotus, as we shall see in the next chapter, reported that the Phoenicians, a Semitic-speaking people, according to their own account, originated in Eritrea before migrating to the Middle East. Eritrea is, of course, next door to Ethiopia. Many modern writers have vented their anger against Herodotus for recording data such as this. Furthermore, they have taken particular exception to the father of history, describing the Egyptians as having black skins and woolly hair, as contained in Book 2, Section 104 of his The Histories. Sir John Gardner Wilkinson, the noted English Egyptologist, fired the first shot in 1862. The hair he, i.e. Herodotus, had no opportunity of seeing, as the Egyptians shaved their heads and beards, and the blackness of color is, and always was, a very conventional term, for the Hebrews even call the Arabs black, Kedar, the Cedre of Pliny, though may only mean of dark or sunburnt hue. The Negroes of Africa in the paintings of Thebes cannot be mistaken, and the Egyptians did not fail to heighten the character of that marked race by giving to their scanty dress of hide the ridiculous addition of a tail. Sir John went on to present an image of a black woman with a tail that he claims was found in a Theban tomb or temple. This image, of course, does not exist. The distinguished Egyptologist fabricated it. Concerning Egyptian hair, even if all men Herodotus saw shaved their heads, he would still have observed the hair and wigs of Egyptian women. A wig is, of course, hair taken off of one Egyptian head and placed on another Egyptian head. Finally, we note that Wilkinson has unconsciously provided useful data on the race of the earliest Arabs, citing Pliny and the Hebrews as a source material. We shall return to this question in a much later chapter. W. W. Howe and J. Wells wrote a commentary on Herodotus in 1912. Commenting on Book 2, Section 104, they wrote the following. Herodotus's idea of Egyptian appearance have been somewhat confused by the numerous Negro slaves he saw on the streets of Memphis. As the Egyptians themselves shaved wholly or in part, the woolly hair is the more inexplicable. If Herodotus, as Howe and Wells suggests, confused the Egyptians with Negro slaves, this merely implies that the two peoples were absolutely identical in every visible way. There could not have been any racial difference between them at all. It is possible to confuse Senegalese and Gambians for precisely the same reasons. Incidentally, Fari Supia, our esteemed colleague, pointed out that the part of the royal insignia of the pharaohs was an animal skin worn with the tail hanging down. Perhaps Sir John Wilkinson, in faking the image described above, confused a black woman with a pharaoh. Professor Archibald H. Sayce proved equally upset by Herodotus' disclosure. Confusing the past with the present tense, Sayce declared that the Egyptians are not black-skinned, nor have they woolly hair. This warns us against accepting Herodotus an anthropological authority. As the Egyptians shaved, he had not much opportunity of observing their hair, but seems to have made his observations on their Negro slaves. It is equally difficult to believe that the Colchians were black and woolly haired. Certainly none of the numerous races now inhabiting the Caucasus are so. Sayce correctly describes the modern Egyptians and the modern populations of the Caucasus region, i.e. the Caucasus region or near southwestern Russia, as not being Negroes. This observation is, however, an irrelevance concerning the ancient peoples of both regions. Incidentally, Martin Bernal, author of Black Athena, reproduces an almost identical argument to that given by Sayce. Just as Sayce requires anthropological authority before being able to say whether or not the ancient Egyptians were black, Bernal requires anatomical precision. Just as Sayce confuses the ancient and modern peoples of Egypt and Caucasus, Bernal tells us that, I am convinced that, at least for the last 7,000 years, the population of Egypt has contained African, Southwest Asian, and Mediterranean types. The last 7,000 years are, of course, interesting, but wholly irrelevant. It does not address the question of who the ancient Egyptians were, rather it dodges the issue. Since the time of Wilkinson, Howe, Wells, and Sayce, the attacks on Herodotus have become increasingly tiresome and irritating, consisting of the same empty statements unsupported by counter-evidence. Some writers such as Bernal and Poe attempt to play it both ways by claiming the Colchians were Negroes, but the Egyptians were not. This is untenable scholarly position since the Colchians descended from the Egyptians. The critics of Herodotus are yet to attack Aeschylus, Apollodorus, Aristotle, Diodorus, Galen, Heliodorus, and Lucian, all of whom corroborate him on the Egyptian question. In fact, the critics do not have a single eyewitness description that contradicts Herodotus or any of the above-named classical writers. We give the final word on the Herodotus question to Willem Spielberg, author of the fascinating lecture essay, The Credibility of Herodotus' Account of Egypt in the Light of the Egyptian Monuments. He concludes that our verdict, then, on the credibility of Herodotus, especially with regard to the statement on the history, is distinctly a favorable one. The view that he derived his accounts from books or actually invented them can only be described as ridiculous. That he was in Egypt cannot be doubted by any sane person. Why his observations do not always tally with the facts as we know them has already been explained. Apart from the universal grounds for mistake expressed in ere est humanum, there must be taken into account, inter alia, the rapidity of his journey and the comparatively short sojourn in the country. In addition to all this, there is another factor of great importance. Herodotus, as he himself more than once points out, took no written notes, but relied upon his memory, which, remarkable though it was, could not suffice for a great quantity of details. One enterprising modern writer, Richard Poe, suggests a novel way of undermining the classical writers' descriptions of ancient Egyptians. He believes that, contrary to the claim of some experts, Greek and Roman authors offer no definitive answer to whether we should call the Egyptians black, in the modern sense of the word. As evidence, he cites the writings of the Roman poet Manlius, who felt that the Ethiopians stain the world and depict a race of men steeped in darkness. Less sunburnt are the natives of India the land of Egypt, darkens the bodies mildly. In moderate climate imparts a medium tone. The sun god dries up with dust in the tribes of Africans amid their desert lands of the Sahara. The Moors derive their names from the faces, and their identity is proclaimed by the color of their skins. Based on this, Mr. Poe believes that the Manalist describes 5 dark-skinned populations ranging from the Ethiopians, the darkest in shade, through the Indians, Egyptians, Saharans, and finally the Moors, the lightest. Poe further reasons that the Egyptians were 2 shades lighter than the Ethiopians, but 2 shades darker than the Moors. Poe concludes that the Egyptians, unlike the Ethiopians, were too light in complexion to be classified as real Negroes in the modern sense of the word. We note that while Poe may be correct in suggesting a sliding scale of shades from Ethiopians to Moors, it still does not prove what he thinks it proves. Juvenal, as we have already seen, describes the Moors as midnight black. If the Egyptians were 2 shades darker than this, they and all other groups, the Saharans, Indians, and Ethiopians included, must have been very dark indeed. Moreover, the classical writers classify the Libyans as Ethiopians. The Libyans, as we have already seen in Chapter 4, were the same peoples as the Moors. D.E.L. Haynes, an authority on Libyan antiquities, was forced to admit some ancient sources describe the Germantes, a Libyan people, as Ethiopians. Herodotus collected information from the ancient Tunisian civilization of Carthage about some of their trading voyages. The Carthaginians still relate the following story. Beyond the Pillars of the Hercules, there exists a Libyan country inhabited by men who they visit. They unload their goods and lay them neatly on the shore edge, and they reboard their vessels and send up signals of smoke to attract the notice of the natives. The latter, seeing the smoke, draw near to the sea, place next to the goods the gold they are offering in exchange, and withdraw. The Carthaginians disembarked once more and examine what they've been left. If they estimate that the amount of gold matches the value of the goods, they take it away and raise anchor. If not, they return to their ships and wait. The natives, coming back in their turn, add more gold until the Carthaginians are satisfied. Neither side does the other any wrong. All historians who have considered this question know that the Libyan country of which the Carthaginians spoke was Guinea in West Africa. The method of trade described is called dumb barter, and 2,000 years later this was still used in that part of the world. This makes the people of Guinea, the so-called true Negroes, authentic Libyans. Furthermore, Professor Serge Lancel of the University of Grenoble paraphrased an ancient source that describes the trade between the Phoenicians and the people of Cernei, far to the north of Guinea, along the coast of Western Sahara. Around the end of the 6th century BC, a passage in Periplus of the Pseudo-Syllax would be more precise about what the Phoenician traders were then offering the Ethiopians. Combining the two sources, notice that the Guineans to the south are called Libyans, but the Saharans to the north are called Ethiopians. Synthesizing the classical sources, E.W. Bovell, the English author of The Golden Trade of the Moors, wrote that ethnologically the Germantes are not easy to place, but we may presume them to have been Negroid. The Arab writers of the 8th and 9th centuries A.D., as we have already seen, classify the Copts, i.e. Egyptians, the Fazani, i.e. Saharians, and the Berbers, i.e. Moors, as peoples of the Sudan, i.e. black. One such writer adds that they were the posterity of Cush. In addition, Professor Diop wrote that Strabo goes even further in his geography and attempts to explain why Egyptians are blacker than Hindus. This contradicts the sliding scale of Manalus and places the Egyptians and the Ethiopians 1 shade apart. However, Godfrey Higgins paraphrases Arrian as saying, "The inhabitants upon the Indus, i.e. Indians, are in their looks and appearance not unlike the Ethiopians." See also pages 578, 588. Arrian then goes on to state that among the Indians were darker people in the south and lighter people in the north. He correctly compares the difference to Egyptians being, on average, lighter than Ethiopians, i.e. Sudanese, in Africa. But if the Indians were not unlike the Ethiopians, including those of the lighter complexion, then the Egyptians were also not unlike the Ethiopians. This corroborates Diodorus, who stated that the Egyptians were originally an Ethiopian colony. Finally, Eratosthenes wrote, "On the left of the course of the Nile alive Nubae, i.e. Nubians, in Libya, a populous nation. They begin from Meroe and extend as far as the bends of the river." We conclude, therefore, that the color scale deduced by Poe has such a limited range of shades, where the darkest, i.e. Sudanese, the lightest, i.e. Garamantes, and those in between, i.e. Egyptians and Indians, were called Ethiopians or were not unlike the Ethiopians. Bovell calls the Garamantes, who were part of Poe's lightest group, Negroid. Moreover, this was same relatively light-colored group, the Moors, were midnight-colored according to Juvenal. Furthermore, this same light-colored group, the Libyans, included the people of Guinea, the so-called true Negroes, and also the Nubians, i.e. Ethiopians. This destroys Poe's entire theoretical edifice with nothing left to support it. Some writers allege that Egyptian skulls share affinities with those of the Europeans. While this view contains particles of truth, it is really an argument presented by those who know nothing about human origins. The African origin of the human race implies that the facial or physical variations noted among the many peoples around the world first made their appearance on the African continent. Many South African Negroes, the Khoisan, for example, have a Chinese-like appearance with respect to their faces, in particular their eyes. A good example is Nelson Mandela, the former South African head of state. We have, of course, put the cart before the horse. The reality is that it is the Chinese who resemble South African Negroes in this respect, not the other way around. Even facial features associated with Caucasians, such as the thin lips and narrow noses, existed among African Negroes, independently of any intermarriage with the Caucasians, and existed before Caucasians came into existence. The Tutsi of Central East Africa are a good example. Their narrow features have developed independently of any exotic admixture. Therefore, skulls can sometimes be used to prove the existence of Negroes when they have facial features unique to Negroes and distinct from Caucasians or Mongolians. However, skulls cannot be used as the sole evidence to prove the existence of Caucasians. Caucasian skulls are not sufficiently distinct from those of many East African Negroes. It follows that Egypt also in East Africa contained thinner-lipped and narrower-nosed Negro types, resembling the Somalis or Ethiopians of today. Their skulls, when examined by anthropologists, were systematically misclassified, given the false view that 30 or 40% of the Egyptian skulls were Caucasian, when they should have been classified as East African. In the early 19th century, it used to be claimed that Negro skulls were the longest, Mongolian skulls were the shortest, and Caucasian skulls were in between. Based on this classification, Dr. Madden in the 1820s drew the following conclusion about the ethnicity of ancient Egyptians. The traveler Dr. R. Madden, says a modern writer, made a special study of the skulls of different Eastern races at the beginning of the 19th century. In Upper Egypt, he saw several thousand mummy heads, and he opened the heads of 50 mummies. They were all extremely narrow across the forehead and oblong in shape, like the heads of Nubians in measurements rather than like of those of Copts. Herodotus was correct. Dr. Madden was not alone in this view. In 1883, Captain Richard Burton wrote to the English Egyptologist Gerald Massey and remarked that, "You are quite right about the African origin of the Egyptians, and I have sent home 100 skulls to prove it." In addition, Dr. Madden demonstrated that there were no affinities between the skulls of the modern Copts and the skulls of the ancient Egyptians. He concluded that, "From the table it is evident that there is no affinity between the head of the ancient Egyptian mummy and that of the modern Copt. But allowing in all measurements 3/4 of an inch for difference of the scalp on the modern Nubian head, it follows that the measurement of the latter corresponds with that of the mummy head in every particular." The conclusions outraged the racists, and therefore new criteria were added to what determines the ethnicity of a skull. It was now declared that Negro skulls had to be dolichocephalic, but also contain a short, broad face. Mongolian skulls were deemed to be brachiocephalic, with flat faces, and Caucasian skulls were mesocephalic, with long faces. Based on this classification, Falkenberger arrived at the following conclusions. Falkenberger reopened the anthropological study of the Egyptian population in recent work, says Professor Diop, in which he discusses 1,787 male skulls were varying in date from the old pre-dynastic to our own day. He distinguishes four main groups. Page 421. The sorting of the pre-dynastic skulls into these four groups gives the following results for the whole pre-dynastic period. 36% Negroid, 33% Mediterranean, 11% Cro-Magnoid, and 20% of individuals approximating either to the Cro-Magnoid or to the Negroid. The conclusion drawn was still unacceptable. In the United States, anyone with any African ancestry, no matter how remote, were legally classified as Negroes. Using this one-drop rule, African American historians claim that ancient Egypt was 56% black. They arrived at this by adding the 36% of the Negroes to the 20% of individuals approximating either to the Cro-Magnoid or to the Negroid, i.e. mixed race. We disagree with their conclusions for two reasons. Firstly, modern American systems of classification have no place in the ancient world. Secondly, the African Americans have failed to tackle either Falkenberger's Mediterranean or Cro-Magnoid categories. The Mediterranean category in the popular mind implies Greeks, Spaniards, Italians, white North Africans, and Israelis. For a physical anthropologist, on the other hand, it implies dolichocephalic skulls with long, narrow faces. There are two populations that generally possess these traits, some European populations and some East African populations. Since Egypt is also in East Africa, it is simpler to theorize that the 33% Mediterranean skulls resemble East Africans rather than Europeans. The Cro-Magnons are the earliest people to inhabit Europe, the ancestors of white-skinned people. These early people, creators of the Aurignacian culture, were Negroes, as has already been seen in an earlier chapter. Falkenberger's 20% approximating either to the Cro-Magnoid or to the Negroid can only be a mixture of Negroes with Negroes. We therefore conclude that all Falkenberger's pre-dynastic skulls were of Negroes. Moreover, this is the simplest and therefore the most scientifically acceptable reading of this evidence. Mr. J. Michael Crichton, author of Jurassic Park, wrote an important study on the Egyptian and East African crania in 1966 called A Multiple Discriminant Analysis of Egyptian and African Negro Crania. He concluded that, as expected, the Negroes are distinguished from the Egyptians principally in nasal region. The Negro nose is large, broad, and flat. The breadth of the Negro face is also distinctive. This study does not agree, however, with Crutzen-Bennington's conclusion that Egyptians are more long-headed than the Negroes. No significant differences in head length were discovered. Professor Shomarka Kita of Howard University has created something of a revolution in Egyptian physical and anthropology. He has shown that the skull, like any other physical attribute of people, will reflect the continual shaping influence of the environment upon it. Thus, a population that starts out broad-nosed can evolve narrow noses over thousands of years due to environmental selection pressure in a very cold climate. This has happened in Europe as Cro-Magnon evolved into its white-skinned descendant. The same thing can happen in a very hot climate. Narrow noses can evolve to restrict the effect breathing dry heat. As an example, Kita discusses the Tutsi of Central East Africa. Hirno, 1975, has accounted for a variation in Africa using a non-racial approach. He does not specifically address the Northern Nile Valley in great detail, but his concepts, based on microevolutionary principles, adaptation, drift, selection, are applicable in region in the light of recent archaeological data. For example, in living and fossil tropical Africans, narrow faces and noses versus broad Negro ones do not usually indicate European or Near Eastern migration or Europoid Caucasian genes, called Hamitic as once taught, but represent indigenous variation, either connoting a hot, dry climatic adaptation or resulting from drift. Dana Reynolds Marniche, another African American, wrote a useful paper entitled The Myth of the Mediterranean Race, where she noted that Much of the problem with the older chronometric studies lay in the fact that scholars believe that the form of the human skull, as indicated by cephalic index, was a permanent racial character. Carlson and Van Gerven have shown that within a single population, it is possible for a variation to occur in size and shape of noses. This reflects different environmental pressures in each locality rather than a different or mixed population. With regard to Crichton's 1966 analysis, it is important to consider that his earliest Egyptian groups were spatially separated 432 kilometers to the south of his most recent series. There is the distinct alternative possibility that the differences detected between the earliest and latest groups reflected geographical variation. The nasal aperture, for example, appears to be adaptively responsive to climatic variation. Wolpoff, 1968, Glanville, 1969, and appears to be clinically distributed. Interestingly, metric variation in the nasal aperture figured most prominently in distinguishing Egyptian from East African crania. Crichton's results demonstrate that the East African crania are smaller than the Egyptian series and have a broader nasal aperture. The Egyptian series presents a similar continuum, with the crania from the Upper Nile being the smallest and having the broadest nasal aperture. That distribution is consistent with a geographical ecological hypothesis. Drawing together the craniometric studies from Madden to Kita and the summary of Crawford, we conclude that the ancient Egyptian population consisted of one people. They were originally broad-featured and over time evolved through dry heat adaptation into a population showing a mixture of broad and narrow features. The narrow-featured groups resembled the Tutsi, Somalis, and Ethiopians. In addition, no research has ever suggested that any of the ancient Egyptian crania resembled those of the modern Copts. Unlike some of the modern East African populations, however, other evidence indicates that the Egyptians had brittle rather than soft hair. Or does it? The hair of the ancient Egyptian mummies has been used to claim that they were not Negroes. Sir John Gardner Wilkinson, for example, wrote that the mummies prove that the Egyptians were neither black nor woolly-haired, and the formation of their head at once decides that they are Asiatic and not of African origin. Don Brothwell and Richard Spearman wrote a foundation article called The Hair of the Earlier Peoples, written for archaeologists. This valuable paper shows how to interpret and handle ancient hair evidence. They mention, for example, that some surviving Egyptian hair samples are dark brown in color, others are brown, and some are now blonde. Samples of hair from the Canary Islands, dating from 700 to 1200 AD, range in color from dark brown to blonde. An 18th century sample of hair from Malawi was found to be dark brown. What should we make of this? The blonde hair is particularly interesting, wrote Brothwell and Spearman, especially as the cases noted in early material are from Egypt, Peru, and the Canary Islands, areas now generally associated with dark hair. As far as we can tell, this fair hair color was not the result of intentional bleaching. Although burial can result in some degree of fading, as evidenced by the changes in modern hair after burial for many months, it seems very unlikely that such a light color could result from the originally dark specimen. A possible solution to this question might be the examination of actual melanin granules themselves under the electron microscope. Even if some of the blonde samples are the results of staining by the embalming fluid, as already suggested by Bachrawi, or ground solutions, that this might indicate their true color. Ancient hair keratin was often stained with the yellowish-brown patches from the deposits in all burial sites, but causes no confusion with the melanin, as this appears as dark granules under the microscope. Transverse sections of hair from the Egyptian mummy were interesting in that there was a strong uniform reddish fluorescence of keratin with acridine orange, but the melanin granules in the medulla and cortex were black. Brothwell and Spearman draw a conclusion on the light hair color of this particular mummy. In view of the covering of the body of the mummy with the cloth, it suggests that atmospheric oxidation was not responsible for this change, which may have been produced by the embalming preparation. The texture of the hair can also be affected. This produces the same effect as permanent waving, i.e. a perm. As an example, they show what can happen to sheep's wool. Hair is largely made up of fibrous protein keratin. This substance is extremely resistant to decomposition and enzymatic digestion, mainly owing to the presence of disulfide cross-linkages of an amino acid cysteine. These join together the long polypeptide chains of the molecule. If these cross-linkages are broken by reduction of oxidation, altered keratin is readily attacked by proteolytic enzymes. The chief factors which alter keratin are probably atmospheric oxidation, soaking in water, and alkaline pH of the soil. These changes can occur in a living animal. Thus, atmospheric weathering of the fleece in sheep results in loss of cysteine from the exposed tips of the fibers. Permanent waving, i.e. a perm, alters the keratin cross-linkages, and these changes have been detected by fluorescence microscopy. Jarrett, unpublished. It is probable that if the preparations employed during mummification contain reducing or oxidizing agents or alkaline substances, the hair keratin would be damaged. This shows that the hair has suffered from preparations during mummification, atmospheric oxidation, soaking in water, or deleterious alkaline pH of the soil, can suffer damage similar to permanent waving. This would have the effect of straightening Negro hair, just as it can straighten out sheep's wool. Consequently, mummies such as Yuya, Thoya, and Ramses II that possess seemingly blonde or red hair are likely to have oxidized or stained hair. These mummies and the others that possess seemingly straight hair probably display similar and related hair damage that has resulted in permed or straightened hair. None of this is genuine Caucasian straight hair. The fact that a Malawi hair sample has turned dark brown in only 200 years or so supports this interpretation. Professor Martin Bernal is author of widely discussed work entitled Black Athena. It is difficult to draw any conclusions about the ethnicity of ancient Egyptians from this book, however, but he does appear to claim that 4 of the Egyptian dynasties consisted of pharaohs whom one can usefully call black. Whatever this means, he feels convinced that many of the most powerful Egyptian dynasties, which were based in Upper Egypt, the 1st, 11th, 12th, and 18th, were made up of pharaohs whom one can usefully call black. We do not know if usefully call black means Negro as used in this book, but we shall ask a slightly different question. Is it possible for a scholar to usefully blacken these dynasties without usefully blackening the other dynasties? Bernal appears to think so. The Venerable Carter G. Woodson wrote a handbook for the study of the Negro many years ago entitled The African Background Outlined. In this work, we read the following. The statues of Rahotep and Nefert, of Khafra, Amenhot I and III, Usertesen I, Tahatems III, Queen Mutima, and Ramses II show distinctly Negroid features. Mr. J. A. Rogers wrote, I have seen Negroes here, i.e. in the U.S., and in Africa, who bore a striking resemblance to Seti the Great. In addition to the portrait statues, Thutmose III, Ramses II, and Seti I were shown to have Negro body proportions by Robbins and Shute. You may recall from the previous chapter that all 3 men raised monuments to venerate their ancestors, the tablets of Karnak, Sakara, and Abidos. According to MacNaughton, the Karnak list has names of kings from dynasties 4, 5, 10, 11, 12, and 13. It may also have once possessed the names of kings of dynasties 6 and 8, but these names were erased from the first line of the document. MacNaughton believes that this is the list approximately in chronological order and adds that the Karnak list probably does not extend further than to the end of the 13th dynasty. According to Budge, the Abidos list mentions kings of dynasties 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 11, 12, 18, and 19. The Sakara list contains the same kings as those of Abidos, but a smaller number of kings are listed. The 3 lists, when combined, list about 100 kings from the dynasties 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 11, 12, 13, 18, and 19. They may have also contained a name of a king or two from Dynasty 8. The conclusion is inescapable. If Thutmose III, Seti I, and Ramses II were Negroes, then all of the 100 or so ancestor kings were also Negroes. It is possible that Bernal thinks that the 4 dynasties concerned were usefully black due to them being foreign, i.e. Nubian or semi-Nubian in origin. He seems to suggest as much as by highlighting the Upper Egyptian origins of these kings. If so, didn't Dynasty 2 share the same finite origins of Dynasty 1? Was it not Sir Flinders Petrie who wrote that a conqueror of Sudani features founded the 3rd dynasty and many new ideas entered the country? Wasn't Dynasty 4 among the 18 Ethiopian pharaohs mentioned by Herodotus? Wasn't Dynasty 5 of Elephantine origins? Wasn't Dynasty 17 the ancestors of Dynasty 18? How did these dynasties escape from being usefully called black? In conclusion, we note that it is not possible to give some of the ancient history of Egypt back to Africa without giving all of it back. Bernal's position here, as elsewhere, is untenable. Some historians have pointed out that the Egyptians distinguished themselves from Negroes in their literature. In Nile Valley history, there were indeed conflicts between Egypt and Nubia, causing the Egyptians to take stern measures against the Nubians. These conflicts are reflected in the Egyptian documents. One such document associated with Senworset III reads as follows: I am the king, my word is performed. My hand performs what my mind conceives. I attack my attacker. The man who retreats is a vile coward. He who is defeated and on his own land is no man. Thus is the black. He falls down at a word of command. When attacked, he runs away. When pursued, he shows his back in flight. The blacks have no courage. They are weak and timid. Their hearts are contemptible. I have seen them. I am not mistaken about them. The inscription quoted in the Professor de Graaf Johnson's classic African Glory clearly implied that the Egyptians considered themselves to be a distinct race to the blacks. After all, why would they describe the Negroes in this way and ban them from entering Egypt? The solution to this puzzle was provided by Professors Yosef Ben Yochanan and Sheikh Anta Diop in their respective works. The text and many others like it had in fact been wrongly translated. The word mistranslated into English as blacks or Negroes is Nisi, generally given as Nehesi or Nahasi or Nehusi in the transliterations. Nehisi has national, not racial, connotations and refers to Nubians. Dr. Welsby, as we have seen, suggests that Nehisi is a geographical term that identifies the Nubians who live along the Nile as opposed to those of the eastern desert. Dr. de Graaf Johnson, an otherwise reliable historian, was unaware of this. Equally unaware were Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois and Dr. Chancellor Williams. These writers believe that since the Egyptians distinguished themselves from Negroes, the Egyptians had to have been mulattoes. The authentic Egyptian word for blacks is Kemetu, or a name the Egyptians used to describe themselves. The text, when correctly translated, should have read, I am the king, my word is performed. My hand performs what my mind conceives. I attack my attacker. The man who retreats is a vile coward. He who is defeated on his own land is no man. Thus is the Nubian. He falls down at a word of command. When attacked, he runs away. When pursued, he shows his back in flight. The Nubians have no courage. They are weak and timid. Their hearts are contemptible. I have seen them. I am not mistaken about them. The insults thrown at the Nubians by Senworset III carry no racial connotations. They are merely national or geographical insults. The Egyptologists have allowed the mistranslations to continue uncorrected since it served their ideological and racist interests to do so. We now review the question of the artistic depictions. The ancient Egyptians used a particular artistic canon that could possibly deceive the modern scholar. By convention, they represented men with a red skin color and women with a yellow skin color. There are paintings where some of the men are represented with red and some with yellow skins, and in others, women are painted with red skins. In some of these images, Nubians are depicted, but in the colors dark brown or jet black. This has led scholars to speculate that the ancient Egyptians were a red-skinned or perhaps yellow-skinned race. Moreover, they were a different race to the Nubians. Dr. Madden, cited earlier, held the queer view that these relatively light colors were themselves close approximations to the authentic colors of the modern Nubians. He wrote that, I was more struck here than anywhere else by the different complexions given to the sexes in their pictures. The men are always painted red, the women yellow. The few colors known to the ancient Egyptians enabled them to approach no nearer to the real complexions of their race. If a painter had now only the use of the primitive colors, he would find red would be the nearest approach to the swarthy complexion of the male Nubian, and yellow to the female, whose tint is much lighter from the less exposure to the sun. But what struck me as the greatest proof I met in Nubia of the identity of the Nubian race and that of the ancient Egyptians is the strong resemblance of the former to the features of all Egyptian statues. Despite Dr. Madden's eloquence, we cannot agree with all of this. Dr. Davidson shed far more light on this issue in a television program entitled Africa, Different but Equal. He showed examples of Egyptian depictions of Nubians, one of which shows Nubian dancing girls depicted in the color red. Another Egyptian painting, this time is showing Egyptian wrestlers from a tomb in Beni Hassan, depicted in red and yellow, were compared by Davidson with modern Nubia wrestlers who are jet black Nubian people who paint their skins red and yellow for ceremonial purposes. The comparisons strongly implied that the red and yellow colors merely represented skin paint, or at the very least, ceremonial significance. There are other examples of Egyptian art that are definitely intended to be race-specific as opposed to being merely ceremonial, such as the famous paintings from the Temple of Ramses III. In these images, Egyptians and Negroes are painted the same way using the same jet black color, contrasting with the colors of other races. Moreover, the Egyptians and Negroes are dressed the same. There are well-known jet black images of pharaohs Mentuhotep II, Thutmose I, and Tutankhamun. In addition, there are a fresco of Thutmose III depicted jet black in one scene and red in another. Clearly, he could not have been both colors. The red has to be symbolic. Furthermore, there are plenty of New Kingdom paintings that depict Egyptian men and women in the same color, namely chocolate brown. These paintings therefore show that the range of real skin tones among the Egyptians ranged from jet black to chocolate brown. M. Champollion, the father of Egyptology, directed attention to other such paintings that he saw in the early 19th century. Right in the valley of Biban el Molek, we admire, like all previous visitors, the astonishing freshness of the paintings and the fine sculptures on several tombs. They wish to represent the inhabitants of Egypt and those of the foreign lands. Thus we have before our eyes the image of the various races of man known to the Egyptians. The first, the one closest to the god, has a dark red color. The legends designate this species as the Egyptians. There can be no uncertainty about the racial identity of the man who comes next. He belongs to the black race. The third, the Asian, presents a very different aspect. His skin color borders on yellow or tan. Finally, the last one, the European, is what we call flesh-colored, a white skin of the most delicate shade. I hastened to seek the tableau corresponding to this one in the other royal tombs, and as a matter of fact, I found it in several. This manner of viewing the tableau is also the more accurate because on the other tombs the same generic names reappear, always in the same order. We find there Egyptians and Africans represented in the same way, which could not be otherwise. But the Namu, the Asians, and the Tamhu, the Europeans, present significant and curious variants. It is worth noting that the ancient Greeks had a tradition of painting men with black skins and women with white skins. As in the Egyptian case, this is merely the artistic canon that they used. It does not prove that Greek men were black. Rather, it shows that a more sophisticated interpretation of the art is required. Finally, we note that the Kushites of antiquity and the Igbos more recently used the same red and yellow color scheme as the Egyptians. In the Kushite pyramid of Pharaoh Tanwatamani, the female deities Isis and Nephthys are depicted in yellow. Hapi, a male deity said to have originated in Uganda, is depicted in red. The Kushite ruler himself is shown as a chocolate brown. This is probably the only natural color in the picture and is well within the true Egyptian and modern Negro skin color range. The Mambari art of Nigeria also depicts individuals as red or yellow. Nobody has yet claimed that the Igbos or Cushites belong to a red or yellow race, or at least not yet. Dr. C. Loring Brace, a physical anthropologist, and his team penned a very influential paper on the race origins of the ancient Egyptians called Clines and Clusters versus Race. The document has been widely quoted and praised for its conclusion that the race concept is largely bogus and that the ancient Egyptians cannot be classified as black or white. In place of race, Dr. Brace et al. Proposed to use the terms cline or cluster. These terms have the advantages of not being racist. How did Dr. Brace et al. Arrive at this interesting conclusion? They measured Egyptian crania using 24 measurement criteria. However, nearly all the measurements they selected to study were focused on the nasal regions of the skulls. In other words, Brace and colleagues read the papers of J. Michael Crichton, cited earlier. Mr. Crichton demonstrated that the only significant difference on average between Egyptian crania and Negro crania was in the nasal region. We believe that this is the true reason Brace et al. Ignored other measurement criteria. Exploiting this fact allowed them to draw the following tentative conclusions. It is obvious that both the pre-dynastic and the late dynastic Egyptians are more closely related to the European cluster than they are to any other major regional clusters in the world. If South Asia, India, is discounted for the moment, the Somalis at the southernmost extent of their series show that there is a continuum of related groups which, given the Norwegians and Lapps in our European sample, runs all the way from the equator to the Arctic Circle. When South Asia is separated into available constituents, as is done on Figure 3, the Somalis change to show a tie with the Egypt-Europe spectrum. In their European cluster, Brace included the Indians, Nubians, and Somalis. Since this is the case, why did they call this cluster European? Why didn't they call it East African cluster or even an Indian cluster? Falkenberger demonstrated that 36% of the crania had broad features, as discussed earlier. All that Brace et al. Had achieved was to dissolve this group into a statistical average to create the misleading impression that all of the Egyptians had narrow features. Falkenberger's study, together with the royal sculptures, proves that this could not possibly have been the case. Brace et al.'s paper seemed to be yet another piece of propaganda designed to create the impression that Europeans were responsible for building Egypt, East Africa, and Indian civilizations. Brace et al. Have presented a little more than an update of true Negro hypothesis as advanced by M. D. W. Jeffries in 1951. In other words, all the arguments that Brace and his team present are either taken directly or indirectly from Jeffries or from J. Michael Crichton. The only difference is that they avoid the term white race. In its place, they substitute the less threatening European cline or European cluster. Furthermore, they present nothing that Professor Yosef Ben Yochanan did not publicly refute in 1971 with the publication Africa, Mother of Western Civilization. Due to the importance that the Egyptological mainstream has given this paper, we now discuss the key points raised in the conclusion proper. This section opens with the following disclosure. The attempt to force the Egyptians into either a black or white category has no biological justification. Since Dr. Brace and colleagues are not qualified to give biological opinions, this passage is wholly irrelevant. They are, however, qualified to give anthropological opinions. As we have seen, several anthropological studies clearly place the ancient Egyptians into a black category. One study went as far as to argue that the 2 or 3 race model should be used, wherever possible. Classification by race is still central to physical anthropology. This interested reader should peruse the American Journal of Physical Anthropology to confirm this for him or herself. Egypt was basically Egyptian from the Neolithic right up to the historic times. This is more irrelevant. What does basically Egyptian mean? Is it the Egyptian of Herodotus, the father of history? Is it the Egyptian of De Volney, the father of Orientalism? Is it the Egyptian of Champollion, the father of Egyptology? Which is it? In 1989, the Dallas Museum of Natural History sponsored an exhibit at the Texas State Fairgrounds depicting Egyptian culture at the time of Ramses the Great. When the Blackology Speaking Committee in Dallas threatened to boycott the exhibit unless Ramses II was represented as black, Mr. Abuela put it Ramses II was neither black nor white, but Egyptian. When he referred to the scope of the exhibit, he stated, "This is an Egyptian heritage and an Egyptian civilization 100%. Egypt, of course, is a country in Africa, but this doesn't mean that it belongs to Africa at large. We cannot say by any means we are black or white, we are Egyptians." This is all irrelevant. Quoting an Arab or Turk as if he was descended from the ancient Egyptians is as inappropriate as quoting a European American as if he was descended from the Aztecs. The ancient Egyptians did not think in terms of race. This is fraudulent. The temple paintings of Ramses III and the paintings described by the father of Egyptology makes it quite clear that the Egyptians did think in terms of race. In addition, they thought in terms of origins. The Egyptian term Kentu means lands of the south. It also means first, foremost, beginnings, and chief. The Egyptian word Yal, a term for inner Africa, means old as in the old country. Moreover, the Egyptian word for west and their word for right is the same word. Similarly, the Egyptian word for east and their word for left is the same word. This shows that the Egyptians oriented themselves to the south, their place of origins. The race concept is not mentioned in Herodotus, the Bible, or any other writings of classical antiquity. This is also fraudulent. Herodotus described the Egyptians as black and woolly-haired. The classical writers Pliny, Vitruvius, Galen divided the regions known to them in northern Europeans, Mediterraneans, and Africans. The book of Genesis divides the people of the region into the descendants of Ham, the blacks, the descendants of Shem, the Semites, and the descendants of Japheth, the Europeans. This racial classification has proved so useful that the anthropologists and linguists continued to use it as major modifications until very recently. Concerning racial hatred, there are ancient Indian hymns dating to around 1000 BC known as the Rig Veda. Their apocalyptic anti-black racism has been known about and discussed by European scholars since the 19th century. Finally, the Babylonian Talmud of 6th century AD placed a most horrific racial spin on the Genesis classification by arguing that it is permissible to enslave the children of Ham. This interpretation was used by Christian scholars to justify the enslavement of black people and by the Dutch Reformed Church to justify apartheid. There is no way that Dr. Brace and colleagues can be ignorant of any of this, since it, i.e. the race concept, has neither biological nor social justification. We should strive to see that it is eliminated from both public and private usage. Its absence will be missed by no one, and we shall all be better off without it. R.I.P. We conclude that far from proving the death of the race concept, Dr. Brace and colleagues have given it a new vitality. They have demonstrated a willingness to deceive their readers to suit racist and ideological agendas. Their paper continues to receive favorable reviews that are unjustified in view of its obvious methodological limitations. One cannot, for example, perform a comprehensive craniometric study by focusing the bulk of measurements on the nasal region, nor can one classify disparate peoples such as East Africans, Indians, Europeans as belonging to the European cluster. Furthermore, the concluding section of their paper is astonishingly weak, largely consisting of vacuous and fraudulent statements. Such obvious scholarly weaknesses could not have been tolerated from a black scholar. Ordinarily, no journal would have published such substandard work. We believe that Brace and colleagues have only escaped academic criticism because they have played the gallery. This sorry episode shows why the race concept is far from dead. Belonging to the right clime still brings undeserved advantages. Physical anthropology, corrects understood, has consistently supported the Negro identity of the ancient Egyptians. This has always posed a dilemma for Egyptologists who wish to claim some of their other identity for the Nile Valley people. Adolf Ehrman, writing in 1894, made it quite clear what the ethnological, i.e. physical anthropological position was at the time and the opposition to it. The question of the race origin of the Egyptians has long been a matter of dispute between ethnologists and philologists, the former maintaining the African theory of descent, the latter of Asiatic. Ethnologists assert that nothing exists in the physical structure of the Egyptian to distinguish him from the native African, and that from the Egyptian to the Negro population of tropical Africa, a series of links exists which do not admit of a break. The Egyptians, they maintain, cannot be separated from the Berbers, nor the latter from the Kiwali or the Tibu, nor these again from the inhabitants around Lake Stad. All form one race in mind of the ethnologist, differentiated only by the influence of a dissimilar manner of life and climate. Dr. Keith Crawford penned a fine review of a wide range of modern anthropological studies on the Egyptian skeletal remains. He drew the following conclusions on the people in ancient Egypt from prehistoric through the dynastic periods. Egyptian populations from the Paleolithic period, 35,000 BC, to the pre-dynastic period, display physical features common of Africoids with broad traits, Negroid. Features in African populations that were thought to indicate a Caucasoid influence may be attributable to natural selection and reflect the wide range of variability among the true Africoid types. Morphometric analysis of crania, cephalometric studies, X-ray, estimates of stature, genetic analysis of both non-metric traits and blood groups, and studies of hair and pigmentation show that dynastic Egyptians are related to other Nile Valley and tropical African populations more closely than to any other population outside of Africa. Gene flow from outside of Africa may have introduced Caucasoid genes, particularly during the first and second intermediate periods, dynasties 7 through 10 and 13 through 17, respectively, and the late dynastic period in Lower Egypt. Remains from archaic Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom rulers show affinities to broad Africoid populations, Negroids. Our lengthy discussion of the ethnicity of ancient Egyptians was necessary because some scholars still claim that Negroes did not build any of the Africa's important civilizations. Moreover, they use essentially the same arguments as those refuted here. Endless variations on the true Negro hypothesis. Indeed, if one must believe some Western works, wrote Professor Diop, it is useless to look into the interior of African forests for a single civilization, which, in the last analysis, might be the product of blacks. The civilizations of Ethiopia and Egypt, the express testimony of the ancients notwithstanding, the civilizations of Ife, i.e. Yoruba, and Benin, of the Chad Basin, of Ghana, all those referred to as Neo-Sudanese, Mali, Gao, i.e. Songhai, etc. Those of Zimbabwe, Monomotapa, of the Congo, on the equator, etc. According to the coteries of Western scholars, were created by mythical whites who then vanished as in a dream, leaving the blacks to perpetuate the forms, organizations, techniques, etc., which they had invented. On an optimistic final note, Dr. Diop opines that such modes of thought obviously cannot persist forever.